true story very loosely. The place where I grew up was a little town called Marble Creek. Not much happened there that was well remembered by anyone outside of the town. But things went on. Well, I'm aware of that. We didn't know more of it. We have easier ways to communicate excitement and misery than in the old days. Marble Creek was nestled along the edge of the Sabine River, which is not a wide river, and the river is not that deep. It's a rare spot. But it is a long river, and it winds all through Texas. Back then, there was no trees in now, and your wild animals ran, concrete and houses shine bright in the sunlight. Our little school wasn't much, and I hated going. I liked staying home and reading books I wanted to read, and running to adventures in the woods and fishing the creeks for crawdads. Summers and afternoons and weekends, I did that with my friend Jesse. I knew Jesse's parents lived differently than we did, and so we didn't have money and would probably have been called poor by the standards of the early 60s. Jesse's family still lived out on a farm where they used an outhouse and plowed with mules, raised most of the food they ate, drew water from a well, but curiously had electricity and a big tall TV antenna that sprouted beside their house and could be adjusted for better reception by reaching through the living room window and turning it with a twist of the hand. Jesse's dad was quick to use a razor strop on Jesse's butt and back for things my parents would have thought unimportant, or at worst, an offense that required words, not blows. Jesse and I liked to play Tarzan, and we took turns at it until we finally both decided to be Tarzan, and ended up being Tarzan twins. It was a great mythology we created, and we ran the woods and climbed trees, and on Saturday we watched Jungle Theater in my house, which showed, if we were lucky, Tarzan or Jungle Jim movies, and if not so lucky, Bamba movies. About 5th grade, there was a shift in dynamics. Jesse's poverty began to be an issue for some of the kids at the school. He brought his lunch in a sack since he couldn't afford the cafeteria. And all his clothes came from the Salvation Army. He arrived at history class one morning wearing socks with big S's on them, which stood for nothing related to him, and they immediately became the target of James Williford and Ronnie Ken. They made a remark about how the S stood for sardines, which would account for how Jesse smelled. And sadly, I remember thinking at that age that was a pretty funny crack, until I looked at Jesse's slack, white face and saw him tremble beneath that patched Salvation Army shirt. Our teacher came in then, Mr. Waters, and he caught part of the conversation. He said, "Those are nice socks you got there, Jesse. Not many people can have monogrammed socks. It's a sign of sophistication, something few around here lack." It was a nice try, but I think it only made Jesse feel all the more miserable. And he put his head down on his desk and didn't lift it the entire class. And Mr. Waters didn't say a word to him. When class was over, Jesse was up and out, and as I was leaving, Mr. Waters caught me by the arm. "I saw you laughing when he came in. You've been that boy's friend since the two of you were knee-high to a legless grasshopper." I didn't mean to, I said. I didn't think. "Yeah, well, you ought to." That hit me pretty hard, but I'm ashamed to say, not hard enough. I don't know when it happened, but it got so when Jesse came over, I found things to do. Homework or some chore around the house, which was silly because unlike Jesse, I didn't really have any chores. In time, he quit stopping by, and I would see him in the halls of school, and we would nod at each other, but seldom speak. The relentless picking and nagging from James and Ronnie continued, and as they became interested in girls, it increased. And Marilyn Townsend didn't help either. She was a lovely young thing, and as cruel as they were. One day, Jesse surprised us by coming to the cafeteria with his sack lunch. He usually ate outside on one of the stoops, but he came in this day and sat at the table by himself, and when Marilyn went by and watched her, and when she came back with her tray, he stood up and smiled, politely asked if she would like to sit with him. She laughed. I remember that laugh to this day. It was as cold as a knife blade in the back and equally as sharp. I saw Jesse's face drain until it was white, and she went on by laughing, not even saying a word, just laughing. And pretty soon, everyone in the place was laughing. And Marilyn came by me, and she looked at me and said, "Help me." I saw those eyes of hers and those lips, and whatever made all the other boys jump did the same to me, and I laughed. Jesse gathered up his sack and went out. It was at this point that James and Ronnie came up with a new approach. They decided to treat Jesse as if he were a ghost, as if he were invisible. We were expected to do the same, so as not to be mean to Jesse, but being careful not to burn my bridges with the in crowd. I avoided him altogether. But there were times here and there when I would see him walking down the hall, and on the rare occasions when he spoke, students pretended not to hear him. Or James would respond with some remark like, "Do you hear a duck quacking?" When Jesse spoke to me, if no one was looking, I would nod. This went on into the 9th grade, and it became such a habit, it was as if Jesse didn't exist, as if he really were invisible. I almost forgot about him, though I did note in math class one day there were stripes of blood across his back, seeping through his old worn shirt, his father, and the razor strop. Jesse had nowhere to turn. One afternoon I was in the cafeteria, just about to get in line, when Jesse came in carrying his sack. It was the first time he'd been there since the incident with Marilyn some years before. I saw him come in, his head slightly down, walking as if on a mission. As he came near me, for the first time in a long time, for no reason I can explain, I said, "Hi, Jesse." He looked up at me surprised and nodded, the way I did to him in the hall, and kept walking. There was a table in the center of the cafeteria, and that was the table James and Ronnie and Marilyn had claimed. And as Jesse came closer for the first time in a long time, they really saw him. Maybe it was because they were surprised to see him in his paper sack in a place he hadn't been in ages. Or maybe they sensed something. Jesse pulled a small revolver from his sack, and before anyone knew what was happening, he fired 3 times, knocking all 3 of them in the floor. The place went nuts. People running in all directions. Me, I froze. Then, like a soldier, he wheeled and marched back my way. As he passed me, he turned his head, smiled, said, "Hey, Hap." Then he was out the door. I wasn't thinking about it because I turned and went out the hall behind him, and the history teacher, Mr. Waters, saw him with a gun, said something, and the gun snapped again, and Waters went down. Jesse walked all the way to the double front door, which was flung wide open at that time of day, stepped out into the light and lifted the revolver. I heard it snap and saw his head jump and went down. My knees went out from under me, and I sat down right there in the hall, unable to move. When they went to tell his parents what had happened, that Marilyn was disfigured, Ronnie wounded, and James and Mr. Waters were dead, they discovered them in bed where Jesse had shot them in their sleep. The razor strop lay across them like a dead snake.